All right, so for our fourth ethics discussion, we had to answer some questions referring to the movie My Sister's Keeper. So I watched the movie and have the questions answered here. For this assignment, I have one reference on my reference sheet, as well as I use the content that we learned in class and then knowledge learned from watching the film My Sister's Keeper. So for the first question, identify one of the main ethical dilemmas within the movie that sticks out to you. So the main one that I decided to talk about was the fact that Brian and Sarah Fitzgerald, who are the prominent parents in the film, designed Anna to be a perfect donor for Kate once she was diagnosed with leukemia, and they knew she'd need many procedures. She would be needing donors. So they created a designer baby. So their doctor suggested this off the table, of course, and he himself admitted that he wasn't able to actually kind of advise this option because it would be unethical for a doctor to suggest they create another child for the sake of keeping their sick one alive to use as a donor child, essentially. Um, so Anna was created in what's known as a test tube baby. Before being implanted into Sarah's uterus, the genetics of the embryo were altered in order to perfectly match that of Kate's. So this is most definitely creating designer babies in general and altering genetics, whether it's to get certain eye colors or hair colors or genders or whatever the case is an ethical dilemma on its own. But in this situation, they not only alter the genetics of their child, they did it for the sake of using that child to be a donor for their other child. Um, So, I mean, we discussed this in class as well, but I mean, at what point are you considered to be playing God and playing with life? Because it's hard to tell if there are unforeseen things that may occur as a result of us altering with those things. Whether it's when Anna gets older, if things start to come to light about maybe issues that they weren't expecting that had to do with that genetic altering. For the next question, identify at least two ethical principles or concepts that were discussed in class that were relevant to the movie. So, one very prominent ethical principle that I was in this film is beneficence. So, Kate withstood a life as a patient, going through remission from her leukemia and then relapsing and undergoing many procedures from the time that she was diagnosed as a very young child until her death at the age of 15. Um, and Kate didn't think that she could withstand any more surgery, nor would it really give her any longevity or quality of life. Like she was at the point where she realized that she's not going to survive this anymore. And it was even stated in the movie that she lived much longer than anybody expected her to. Um, so would another surgery truly be in the best interest of Kate, which is what beneficence focuses on? What's in the best interest of the patient? Um, so was having another surgery for the better interest of Kate, or was it her mom that still wanted to keep doing treatments, or maybe her dad? But it seemed to be more prominently her mom that just wasn't ready to lose her child yet and wanted her to keep doing treatments, thinking maybe someday that she would be better and be healthy and be okay. So it seemed as though she just wasn't ready to lose her daughter and wasn't necessarily thinking in her daughter's best interests. But toward the end of the movie, it seemed as though Sarah, so Kate's mom, began kind of seeing what was in the best interest of Kate and understood that Kate just didn't want to be put through any more harmful procedures and things like that when they weren't going to change the outcome, which is where it kind of crosses into non-maleficence, the idea of doing no harm. So wasn't really a huge like profit or a huge reason to be doing these procedures anymore, because Kate knew that this was kind of it for her. So doing more procedures at that point just wouldn't have been. They would have done more harm than good. And then another ethical concept witnessed in this film was Anna wishing to medically emancipate herself from her parents. So she claimed she no longer wanted to be used for parts, is what was stated in the film. Wanted to practice autonomy over her own body, make her own choices. As we discussed in class in New Brunswick, a child under the age of 16 cannot make their own health decisions. These choices are up to the parents. And in the film, I believe Anna was 11. So definitely, I mean, if they were in New Brunswick, definitely would have been under the age of 16. Um, so and these choices are up to the parents unless this minor decide to fight in court to earn or prove their right to be able to make their own health decisions, which in the film we were able to witness some of the court proceedings in the movie, which at the very end you find out they ended up winning and she was medically emancipated from her parents. Anna proved this in court that she was informed and had the capacity to make the decision for herself and no longer wanted to be used for any donoring of any sort for her sister. And I mean, throughout the better part of the movie, we thought it was because she wanted it herself, but come to find out, she knew that her parents wouldn't accept Kate wanting to die peacefully, so she was doing this for her sister. Her sister didn't want any more. It wasn't necessarily her, but regardless, she still in front of that court was able to prove to the judge that she was mature enough to make these decisions for herself, and ended up getting medically emancipated, or which would I mean, she still planned to live with home with her parents and be part of the family that way, but just medically, her parents weren't able to make those decisions for her anymore. Her medical choices were her own. And then the last question that I have here is referring to ethical decision making, or the ethical decision making process. How would you address the ethical dilemma that I mentioned in question one? So the ethical dilemma that I mentioned in the first question was referring to designer babies and the creation of Anna, whether or not that was ethical to create Anna and alter that genetic information in order to help her sister with leukemia. So step one of the ethical decision making process is to identify the issue and whether or not it constitutes an ethical dilemma at all. So the issue here, as I already stated, is creating designer babies. Is it acceptable in order to provide a sibling with a constant donor for medical procedures? And ethical principles that would have been involved here would be autonomy as the child ages and is going for medical procedures, beneficence, whether it's in the best interest of the sibling who is being created for this, but also for the sibling who has leukemia. It may be in the better interest of the child that has cancer and would be receiving donations of whether it's blood. They mentioned granulocytes and leukocytes, as well as toward the end, like the mentioning of donated kidney was thrown about. So it was in the best interest for Kate to be receiving these things because it allowed her to live to the age of 50 and getting, blood draws and bone marrow and all that kind of stuff. But is it in the best interest um, of Anna, the one who was created for this? So step one just involves identifying the issues, identifying the principles involved. Is it an ethical dilemma whatsoever? Which I just did there for us. And then step two of the ethical decision making process is to gather any and all relevant factual data to the situation. So factual information would be here that Kate has leukemia and she will definitely be needing bone marrow, white blood cell transplants, and genetic technology has advanced to allow for alterations to be made to an embryo before implantation through IVF. So a new child could be a perfect donor match. So we know that was something that could be done. We knew that Caitlin had leukemia, and we knew that bone marrow, white blood cell draws were all important. Something else that we knew that was factual, that without donors for these things, Kate would inevitably die, whether that was rather quickly, depending on how advanced her leukemia was upon diagnosis. And also something else was mentioned, donors are uncommon. Plus, it was stated that there are more risks involved using a non-familial donor, as well. Neither her parents were matches. It's very uncommon for parents to be a match for a white blood cell or for any type of transplant, for them to be a close enough match that would be suitable. And as well, she had a little brother at the time, and he was not a match either. And then step three of the ethical decision making process is to clarify the challenge or the problem. So this would include figuring out any values that are involved, evaluating your own as a healthcare provider, checking for value clarification to ensure there is no conflict or coercion. Maybe if someone's values are different than the other, someone thinks that this is right, others think it's wrong, trying to convince the other, vice versa. So the values of Sarah and Brian were unclear in this situation early on. Aside from that, they valued their family. They wanted to do anything absolutely necessary to help their daughter. Ethical principles were already outlined about this in step one, how those may come into effect. The ones making the decisions here inevitably are Sarah and Brian. They're the ones who decided to create this designer baby. They're the ones who make the decisions about any cancer treatment for Kate. The main part in this story that was admittedly unethical was the doctor suggesting that Kate and Brian create their baby in a test tube so they're able to modify her. However, nothing within this that I was able to decipher was really illegal about the act itself. Um, the ethics of it are questionable, um, but nothing necessarily was against the law. Step 4 of the ethical decision-making process is to identify the options for action. So the options presented to Sarah and Brian were to hope for a non-familiar donor, since neither they or their son was a donor, or a close enough match to be a donor. However, using non-familiar donor, as you mentioned, has risks. They could have naturally conceived and hoped to have had a close enough match, or a perfect match. I'm not sure on the specifics if they'd have to be like an exact match for it to be acceptable or not. Um, but if nothing else, they would still be able to utilize umbilical cord blood, stem cells for treatments. That wouldn't be a very like large amount that they could use because we know that Kate ended up needing, transfers of white blood cells and bone marrow and everything else. And with this, they would really only be getting the cord blood, which would be beneficial for a little bit of treatment, but definitely not to the scale that Kate required. Or the other option that they had was what they ended up doing, which was to genetic modify their embryo to ensure a perfect match. And I'm uncertain if all nurses or doctors would have offered that same choice or if it would have happened the same way if they had a different doctor. Because the idea of genetically modifying an embryo is unethical, but this doctor did it for them. Step 5 of the ethical decision making process is to assess the potential options. So, which I've already stated, um, the pros and cons kind of correlated with each one. So the option to utilize a non-familiar donor, but there were risks, or to conceive naturally, but then they might end up having another child that's not a match at all is a possibility, or to do what they did and controversially genetically modify the embryo before implantation to ensure that they had a match. But like I've already previously mentioned, there could be unforeseen risks later in life that may not be detectable by doing this. Um, so none of these options are necessarily illegal, and we as healthcare providers can aid into offering, if nothing else, education pertaining to each one without coercion. Just these are the options. This is what can be done, and I'm sure, knowing that this took place in the states, that would have been very very pricey, going the route that they did, but that's what they chose. Step 6 of the ethical decision making process is to decide on a course of action. So, how will Sarah and Brian justify this decision to create a designer baby? I'm certain they would say that they were doing what was in the best interest of their entire family. It would not kill. It would not involve killing a child or Anna to donate blood or bone marrow, and they would be able to keep Kate alive and healthy. They were practicing beneficence for Kate as they felt having a perfectly matched familial donor was what was best for her. So they made it happen by genetically modifying an embryo for that perfect match. So their doctor offered them as much information as possible concerning this designer baby and claimed off the bat that it wasn't for everybody. That's something he said right in the film. So step 7 of the ethical decision making process is to implement the decision. So this would entail following the steps of IVF, using fertility medicine to mature eggs, extracting the ova, collecting a sperm sample, and then combining in a petri dish, modifying the necessary ways to meet the desired features, and then inserting them into Sarah's womb, where she would then carry the pregnancy to term. Doctors would be involved in this process, and whatever healthcare providers also necessary. So I imagine nurses, fertility specialist, that type of thing. And then, of course, Sarah and Brian were both involved in implementing this plan as well. And then, step 8 of the ethical decision making process is to evaluate and assess your decisions. So, by creating this designer, Brian and Sarah were able to keep Kate alive until the age of 15, where it was stated that it was a miracle and she shouldn't have even made it to the age of 5. So they put Anna through many procedures to help Kate, but I'm certain they would do it again. They got their other daughter 10 more years life in quality of life and the ability to go into remission. And although she sadly relapsed, she did have that time there where she was in limbo of being cancer free. And then an alternative course of action that I would propose to Sarah and Brian as their healthcare provider would be to make the decision to have another child only if they wanted to do it for the sake of having another child, not for the sake of treatment. So there's still a possibility that the child could have been a match, plus the umbilical cord blood could still be usable for treatment as they're unspecialized cells. So that way they don't need to worry about their youngest child growing up with the burden of thinking that their only purpose or reason for existing was to keep their sibling alive, which is something that mentally could have a really big impact on Anna or any child in that situation as they age. All right, so that concludes my ethics for discussion. Thanks.